The Crystal Orchid Hotel in Abuja was glowing with gold lights that could be seen from outside the parking lot. Expensive cars kept arriving one after another while photographers rushed around the entrance capturing every smile, every designer outfit, every moment of Temilade Balogun's engagement party. Inside the ballroom, soft music played under giant chandeliers while waiters carried trays of champagne between tables covered in white roses and candles. Everything tonight was about Temilade. Her mother, Ngozi, proudly walked from guest to guest showing off her daughter's massive diamond ring like it was a trophy. Her father, Deli, laughed loudly with businessmen near the stage while talking about how successful Musa Kamau was. Every conversation somehow returned to Temilade, her beauty, her perfect life, her future wedding. Meanwhile, miles away from all the excitement, Chidera stood quietly in front of her bedroom mirror, staring at the dress lying on her bed. She almost didn't go. Her phone had already buzzed 6 times with messages from her mother. "Don't embarrass us by coming late. At least try to look presentable tonight. People will be there." Chidera closed her eyes for a second and took a deep breath. She already knew how the night would go. Someone would compare her to Temilade. Someone would ask why she was still figuring life out. Someone would make one of those fake polite smiles that secretly carried pity. It happened at every family gathering. Temilade was the daughter everyone celebrated. Chidera was the daughter everyone questioned. She slowly picked up her earrings and forced herself to get ready anyway. Not because she wanted to be there, but because missing the engagement would only give her family another reason to talk about her. As she finally left her apartment and stepped into the Abuja night, a strange heaviness sat in her chest. She had no idea that before the night ended, the same people who ignored her existence would be staring at her in complete shock. Growing up in the Balogun house always felt like living in 2 completely different worlds. When Temilade walked into a room, people smiled immediately. Relatives called her the star of the family. Her pictures filled the living room shelves. Every small thing she did became a celebration. If she passed an exam, there was dinner at a fancy restaurant. If she bought a new handbag, Ngozi proudly showed everyone photos like it was breaking news. But when it came to Chidera, the energy always changed. She was quieter, more reserved. She liked spending time alone, working on her laptop for hours instead of attending parties or posting pictures online like Temilade did. And somehow, her family turned that into proof that something was wrong with her. "You're too serious. You don't know how to connect with people. Why can't you be more like your sister?" Those words followed her for years. At family gatherings, aunties would ask uncomfortable questions with fake concern in their voices. "So, what exactly do you do again? Are you still working from home? Do you even earn enough to survive in Abuja?" Then they would immediately turn toward Temilade and start praising her engagement, her beauty, her social life. Even Deli barely hid his disappointment anymore. Any time Chidera tried explaining her work, he would wave it off like it meant nothing. "All this computer work you do all day, where is the success?" Ngozi was worse sometimes. "She's stubborn," she would whisper to relatives, loud enough for Chidera to hear. "Very difficult child." After a while, Chidera stopped defending herself. She stopped trying to explain the late nights, the endless meetings, the confidential contracts she couldn't talk about, the projects that kept her awake until 3 a.m. Because of the non-disclosure agreements she signed, she could never mention the names attached to her work. She could never post her achievements online. She could never publicly claim the systems she built. So while everyone thought Temilade was the successful daughter, Chidera quietly built things that powerful companies across Africa were already paying millions for. But nobody in her family knew that. To them, success only counted if it was loud. And Chidera's success had always been silent. By the time dinner started, the ballroom was completely alive with music, laughter, and expensive champagne flowing across every table. A giant screen behind the stage displayed pictures of Temilade and Musa smiling on vacations, yacht parties, and luxury dinners while guests kept clapping and cheering. Chidera sat quietly near the end of the family table, barely touching her food. She could already feel it coming. Every family event always had that moment. That one moment where somebody turned her into the joke of the night. Deli slowly stood from his chair as the room became quiet. He adjusted his suit proudly and lifted his wine glass toward Temelaide and Musa. "Tonight is a special night for our family," he said with a wide smile. "My daughter Temelaide has always made us proud." Guests clapped loudly. Temelaide smiled confidently while Musa wrapped an arm around her waist. Then Deli laughed softly and shook his head. "At least one daughter gave us peace of mind." A few people at nearby tables let out awkward little laughs. Others immediately looked down at their plates. Chitara felt her stomach tighten. She kept her face calm, but inside the words hit hard. Deli continued speaking casually, almost like he didn't realize how cruel he sounded. "You know, these days, raising children is difficult. Some listen. Some," he paused dramatically while glancing toward Chitara, "still think life is a guessing game." More uncomfortable chuckles spread through the ballroom. Temelaide lowered her eyes, pretending not to react, but the small smile on her face didn't go unnoticed. Then Ngozi leaned toward one of the microphones on the table with a fake sigh. "Honestly, we keep praying for Chitara," she said. "She still hasn't figured life out yet." The room instantly became tense. Even the waiters slowed down awkwardly. One woman near the front table looked genuinely uncomfortable. Another guest quietly whispered, "That's too much," under his breath. But nobody defended Chitara. Nobody. Chitara forced a tiny smile onto her face while her fingers tightened around her glass under the table. Her chest burned with embarrassment, but she refused to let herself cry there. Not in front of all those people. Not in front of strangers watching her parents humiliate her like she was some family disappointment. And the worst part, Deli and Ngozi truly believed they were being funny. To them, Chitara's pain was entertainment. Meanwhile, across the ballroom, several guests had already started turning toward her with pity in their eyes. The exact kind of pity Chitara hated most. Chitara stayed seated for a few more seconds after the laughter faded, pretending the words hadn't affected her. She even forced herself to smile lightly when one of her mother's friends looked at her with obvious pity. But the pressure inside her chest kept growing. It felt like the entire ballroom was suddenly too small. The music sounded distant. The conversations around her became blurry. All she could hear was her father's voice repeating in her head. "At least one daughter made us proud." Slowly, she stood from the table before anyone could notice the tears building in her eyes. She picked up a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and quietly walked toward the far side of the ballroom near the tall windows overlooking Abuja's city lights. Away from everyone, or at least she tried to be. People still looked at her. Some whispered softly behind their hands. Others gave those fake sympathetic smiles that somehow felt even worse than direct insults. Chitara kept staring down into her drink, pretending not to notice any of it. Inside, she was completely shattered. It wasn't even the embarrassment anymore. It was the realization that nobody cared enough to stop it. Not one person at that table defended her. Not her cousins. Not her aunties. Not even Temelaide. Her own sister had sat there silently while their parents humiliated her in front of hundreds of guests. That hurt the most. One of her older uncles walked past her slowly, almost like he wanted to say something. For a second, Chitara thought maybe he would comfort her. Instead, he awkwardly adjusted his jacket and kept walking without a word. Another relative avoided eye contact completely. It was easier for everyone to stay silent than stand beside the disappointing daughter. Chitara blinked quickly, fighting back tears before they could fall and ruin her makeup. She hated crying in public, hated looking weak in front of people who already looked down on her. So she kept smiling. A quiet, painful smile that took all her strength to hold together. Across the ballroom, she could hear Temelaide laughing loudly with guests near the dance floor while cameras flashed around her. The perfect daughter. The successful daughter. The daughter everyone loved showing off. Meanwhile, Chitara stood alone beside the windows like she didn't belong to the family at all. And for the first time that night, she seriously considered leaving without saying goodbye to anyone. She reached for her purse. That was the exact moment the ballroom entrance suddenly opened. Just as Chitara picked up her purse, the large ballroom doors suddenly opened with a sharp metallic sound. The entire room slowly went quiet. At first, Chitara didn't even look up. She thought it was probably another important guest arriving late for the engagement party. But then she noticed the sudden change in the atmosphere. Waiters stopped moving. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Even the photographers near the stage quickly turned toward the entrance. Two men in black suits entered first, scanning the ballroom carefully through earpieces. Behind them came more security staff, dressed so sharply that people immediately stepped aside to make room. Whispers instantly spread across the room like wildfire. "Oh my God! Is that really him? Solomon Kweku is here." Chitara slowly lifted her eyes toward the entrance. And suddenly, she understood why everyone looked stunned. Solomon Kweku walked into the ballroom with calm confidence, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit that somehow made him stand out without even trying. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. The entire room reacted to his presence automatically. Everyone in Africa knew who he was. Tech billionaire, investor, owner of companies spread across multiple countries. One of the most powerful businessmen on the continent. People literally changed careers hoping to work with him. The energy inside the ballroom shifted instantly. Guests who had ignored each other all night suddenly started fixing their clothes and straightening their posture, hoping to get noticed. Phones quietly appeared under tables as people tried taking secret pictures. Near the stage, Deli almost choked on his drink. Ngozi grabbed his arm tightly with wide eyes. "Why is Solomon Kweku here?" she whispered quickly. Musa looked just as shocked. Temelade immediately adjusted her dress and hair before forcing a glamorous smile onto her face. Within seconds, the family that had humiliated Chitara moments earlier suddenly became nervous and excited like schoolchildren trying to impress a headmaster. Deli rushed forward with the biggest smile Chitara had seen all night. "Mr. Kweku," he said loudly, almost bowing from excitement. "What an unbelievable honor. We had no idea you would attend." Around them, guests stared with open curiosity. Nobody understood why a billionaire like Solomon Kweku would appear at an ordinary engagement party in Abuja. But Solomon barely reacted to Deli's excitement. His eyes calmly moved across the ballroom like he was searching for someone. And then, he stopped walking completely. Because across the room, standing quietly beside the windows with a champagne glass in her hand, Chitara had finally caught his attention. The entire ballroom watched Solomon Kweku carefully as he stood near the entrance. Everyone expected him to walk toward the stage. Or toward Musa. Or maybe toward Deli, since Deli was already smiling so hard his face looked painful. But Solomon didn't move toward any of them. His sharp eyes continued scanning the room calmly, almost like he wasn't interested in the engagement party at all. The music had lowered. The conversations had completely stopped. You could almost feel the tension spreading table by table. Then suddenly Solomon started walking, straight across the ballroom. Guests quickly stepped aside to clear a path for him and his security team. Some people even stood up from their chairs trying to greet him as he passed, but Solomon barely acknowledged anyone. Deli's smile slowly faded when he realized something strange. Solomon wasn't heading toward the family table. He was walking toward the far corner near the windows. Toward Chitara. Confusion instantly spread across the room. Temelade's eyebrows tightened. Ngozi looked completely lost. Even Musa turned around to see who Solomon was approaching with so much focus. Meanwhile, Chitara froze. For a second, she actually looked behind herself to check if someone else was standing there. But there was nobody else. Just her. Her heart started beating faster as Solomon got closer. She had spent months speaking to him through virtual meetings, confidential emails, and encrypted project calls, but they had never met face-to-face before. And nobody in this ballroom knew that. Solomon finally stopped directly in front of her. The entire room stared. His serious expression suddenly softened into a warm smile. "There you are," he said calmly. Then he added words that completely changed the atmosphere of the night. "I've been looking for you." Dead silence. Literal silence. The kind where even breathing suddenly feels loud. Several guests looked at Chitara like they had seen a ghost. Ngozi's mouth slowly fell open. Deli looked completely confused. Temelade's smile disappeared instantly. one of the women near the front tables whispered. Wait, he knows her? But Solomon wasn't finished. Before Chidera could even respond, he gently shook his head with a small laugh. You disappeared after our last call, he said. Do you know how difficult it is to reach someone who ignores half their messages? A few guests nervously laughed, still trying to process what they were seeing. Because moments earlier, this same woman had been publicly mocked by her own family. Now one of Africa's most powerful billionaires was standing in front of her like she was the most important person in the entire ballroom. And suddenly, nobody was looking at Humiliated anymore. The silence in the ballroom didn't break even after Solomon spoke. Everyone was still trying to understand what was happening. Chidera stood frozen, her fingers tight around the champagne glass, her mind racing faster than her heartbeat. Solomon turned slightly toward the crowd, but his words were still directed at her. I told them I would find you, he said softly, almost like he was continuing a private conversation that only she could hear. Then he looked back at the stunned audience. And now I understand why you went silent on the system updates. That sentence made a few people frown in confusion, but for Chidera, it hit differently, because she knew exactly what he was talking about. Solomon exhaled lightly, then gestured toward her with quiet respect. This is the person who designed the core expansion architecture for my tech network, he said clearly. A ripple went through the room. People straightened in their seats. Some leaned forward. Others looked at each other like they had misunderstood something. Solomon continued, calm and firm. Every multi-million-dollar system we recently launched across 3 countries. The payment security layer, the data flow optimization, the AI integration model. He paused briefly, then looked at Chidera again. She built it. The ballroom went completely still again. Chidera's parents stared like they couldn't process the words. Deli actually blinked a few times, like he was waiting for the moment to make sense. Ngozi's hand slowly left her husband's arm. Humiliated looked shocked for the first time all night. Solomon stepped slightly closer to Chidera, lowering his voice just enough so she could feel it more personally than publicly. She signed an NDA, he said, so her name was never allowed in public reports. No interviews, no credit, no recognition. He gave a small, almost proud smile. Basically, she built half of our latest infrastructure and the world has been using it without knowing who made it. Few guests actually gasped. One man whispered, "No way." Another shook his head like he refused to believe it. But Solomon wasn't done yet. And when I say mastermind, he added, I mean she solved problems my entire engineering team couldn't fix for months. Now the room felt different. Not loud, not excited, just stunned, like the air itself had changed. Chidera finally looked up slightly, her expression still controlled, still quiet, but her eyes had a tired honesty in them. Because this was the truth she had been living with for years. Invisible success, silent impact, work that changed industries, but never had her name on it. And now, for the first time ever, the same family that called her a failure was hearing the truth in front of everyone. For a few seconds after Solomon's words, nobody moved. It felt like the whole ballroom was trying to understand how everything had changed so quickly. The same people who were whispering about Chidera a few minutes ago were now staring at her like she was someone completely different. And then it started. Slowly at first. A businessman from the front table stood up and walked toward her. Miss Chidera, I had no idea you were behind those systems, he said carefully, almost nervous. That work changed our entire payment structure. Then another guest followed. Then another. Within minutes, the same people who never even looked at her earlier were now trying to talk to her, introduce themselves, shake her hand, and get her attention. Chidera didn't even know how to react. She just stood there quietly, nodding politely, still overwhelmed by everything happening around her. But across the room, the energy had completely shifted. Deli looked like he had forgotten how to sit properly. He kept adjusting his suit, glancing around like he was trying to understand when exactly the night turned upside down. Ngozi's face had gone pale. She kept forcing small smiles, but her eyes were full of panic, because now she understood something very clearly. This wasn't just success. This was power, and they had spent the entire night humiliating it in front of everyone. Humiliated, on the other hand, was struggling the most. At first she tried to smile like nothing had changed. She even laughed softly at something Musa said, trying to stay calm, but it wasn't working. Every time someone walked past her to talk to Chidera instead, her smile started to fade a little more. For the first time, she wasn't the center of attention anymore. And she hated it. Musa noticed her expression and whispered something to her, but she barely responded. Her eyes kept drifting back to Chidera, who was now surrounded by guests asking questions about projects, systems, and companies she had quietly built behind the scenes. The engagement party, which was supposed to be about Humiliated's perfect future, had completely shifted focus. Even the photographers had turned away from the stage and started capturing Chidera instead. Flash after flash, click after click, like the story of the night had suddenly changed. And standing near the window, Chidera finally felt it. No joy, not revenge. Just a quiet, heavy realization. The same room that once ignored her was now unable to look away from her. Delhi finally couldn't hold it in anymore. The pressure, the stares from guests, the sudden shift in respect, everything was making him uncomfortable. He slowly walked toward Chidera, trying to regain some control over the situation. His voice came out awkward, not as strong as before. "You should have told us," he said, adjusting his collar like it could fix the moment. For a second, it almost sounded like he was blaming her again, like somehow this was still her fault. Chidera turned slowly to face him. The room was still watching. Everyone, her parents, Humiliated, Musa, the guest. Even Solomon stayed quiet, standing a little behind her like he was giving her space. Chidera didn't look angry. She didn't raise her voice. She just gave a small, tired smile, the kind of smile that comes after years of being misunderstood. Then she spoke, softly but clearly enough for everyone to hear. "You already decided who I was." A pause fell over the entire room again. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the background music felt like it had disappeared. Chidera looked at her father directly, her voice still calm, but now carrying everything she had held inside for years. "You decided I was a failure," she continued, "before you ever asked me what I was doing." Delhi opened his mouth slightly, but no words came out. Chidera took a small breath and went on. "You never came to my meetings. You never asked about my work. You never listened when I tried to explain. You just assumed." Her eyes didn't shake, but her voice carried something heavy. "You just never cared enough to ask." That last line landed harder than anything else that night. Silence again. Deep, uncomfortable silence. Even the guests who had been whispering earlier now looked down, as if suddenly realizing they were part of something painful. Ngozi looked like she wanted to say something, but her lips stayed closed. Humiliated stood completely still, her earlier confidence gone. Delhi just stood there, stuck between embarrassment and realization, unable to defend himself because for the first time, he knew it was true. Chidera didn't wait for a reply. She simply looked away from him, as if the conversation had already ended years ago in her heart. And that silence said more than any argument ever could. The tension in the ballroom slowly settled into something strange after Chidera's words. Nobody really knew what to say anymore. The energy had completely changed, and now even breathing felt different in that room. Solomon finally stepped forward again, breaking the silence in a calm, controlled voice. "I want to make this official," he said, looking around the room briefly before focusing on Chidera. "We are offering her a global partnership position in our next expansion phase." A soft wave of shock moved through the guests again. This time, even the investors and businessmen who understood power were impressed in a different way. It wasn't just success anymore, it was authority. Delhi immediately tried to step in, his voice suddenly polite, almost rushed. "We are very proud of our daughter," he said quickly, forcing a smile that didn't feel real anymore. Ngozi also moved closer, her tone changing completely. "Chidera, my daughter, we always believed in you," she said softly, trying to sound emotional. But it was too late. Chidera just looked at them without anger, without excitement, without anything heavy at all. It was like she had already left that version of her life behind. She didn't argue. She didn't respond much. She just gave a small nod and quietly turned away, because none of it felt real anymore. Not their pride. Not their apologies. Not their sudden love. Later that night, the event moved to a luxury rooftop after-party overlooking the glowing city of Abuja. Music played softly in the background, and the air felt cooler, calmer. Chidera stood near the edge of the rooftop, looking at the city lights below. Solomon stood beside her, hands in his pockets, speaking in a low voice. "The people who mock quiet success usually depend on noise," he said calmly. Chidera let out a small peaceful smile, not a big one, just something real for the first time that night. Her phone suddenly vibrated in her hand. One message. Then another. Her mother calling again and again. She looked at the screen for a moment, then turned it off and slipped it back into her purse. Ignored. Because this time she didn't need to answer. As the wind moved softly across the rooftop, one final thought settled over everything she had lived through. They called me a failure in front of everyone, until the most powerful man in the room came looking for me.